Alright, so, hold on just a minute. Just checking something. Okay, never mind, okay. So we'll be talking about chapter 36, Nationalism and Political Identities in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So India always wanted the Home Rule, the Indian National Congress in 1885 being the first and most important nationalist organization to promote self-rule. They initially stressed collaboration with the British as a path towards self-rule. However, World War I would radicalize this, with the influence of Wilson's self-determination and Lenin's anti-imperialism. This initially had support from both Hindus and Muslims. However, after World War I, the British, in line with their traditional divide and rule and exacerbate ethnic tensions policy, encouraged the development of the Muslim League to blunt and divide Congress. Muslims, who had usually been favored by the British in ruling India, had become concerned that the Indian National Congress would replace the British with Hindu leadership. The British also attempt to quell protests between Hindus and Muslims, and they would often be harsh, repressive, and ineffective. So, the father of Indian independence would be Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but oh well. He was a well-to-do Hindu actually, and studied law in London and practiced as a barrister or lawyer in South Africa. He would oppose apartheid for 25 years. He returned to India in 1915 and made the Indian National Congress into a mass movement, which reached village hearts with homespun clothes, simplicity, and vegetarianism. He was titled Mahatma, or Great Soul. He would oppose the caste system and fought particularly hard for the untouchables, whom he named the Harijans, or Children of God. Now, of course, if you want to know some other interesting facts about Gandhi, he studied the very fatalistic Bhagavad Gita daily. He was against industrialization, favoring homespun clothes, as opposed to Nehru, who saw steel mills as the new temples. He would also use daily saltwater enemas and renounced sex, but slept with a young woman to test himself. He's also an anti-Zionist, thinking Zionism was imperialism. But, he was still in the Mount Rushmore of good, along with Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King Jr., and that sort of like. So here's a picture of Gandhi. So, Gandhi stressed the ideas of Ahimsa, or non-violence, and Satygraha, truth and firmness, which had deep roots in India. He advocated for passive resistance, based off of civil disobedience advocated by Thoreau, which gained popular support. Of course, this doesn't exactly work out, this doesn't go completely smoothly, as you have the Amritsar massacre, in which 319 Indians are slaughtered by British during a peaceful protest. In response, Gandhi initiates a non-cooperation movement, which called for the boycott of British clothes and a return to homespun and cotton clothing, as he viewed correctly that the British textile industry had effectively ruined India by deindustrializing and turning nothing into but a cash cow and a cotton producer. He also initiated a civil disobedience movement, resulting in the famous Salt March, which proved the efficacy of social disobedience. Now, the British attempt to temporarily appease them with the Government of India Act. It created an autonomous legislature with a British-dominated executive. Of course, the 600 nominally sovereign princes refused to cooperate, as the Muslims fear Hindu dominance. You also have the traditional economic divide with Hindu landlords and Muslim tenant farmers, especially severe to Great Depression because the agricultural sector was the hardest hit. And as a result, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the father of modern Pakistan, would propose a two-state solution to independence. In the sense, there will be a Hindu state of India and a Muslim state of Pakistan. In 1911, a revolution thrown out the Qing dynasty but this was done basically, in an ad hoc faction, as there was no dominant faction ready to take control. Sun Yat-sen becomes briefly the president of a Chinese republic, but he is quickly overthrown by our warlord. Political anarchy, unsurprisingly, quickly follows. Now, World War I peace deliberations gave legitimacy to Japanese seizures during the war. There was no self-determination for China. So the students' urban intellectuals feel betrayed, and thus they protest for interference, especially that from Japan. Anti-imperialist Marxism increasingly grows in popularity as people are disgusted with the self-serving West grew. The Chinese Communist Party is founded in Shanghai in 1921, and its eventual leader becomes Mao Zedong. But the main man was Sun Yat-sen, who created the Nationalist People's Party. His three principles were he had three principles of the people: national independence, democracy, and economic development. Sounds pretty great, right? He accepts support for the Soviet Union, but he's not a communist. He just does it because he needs the support. The members of the Chinese Communist Party also joined the Guomindang, and of course, and for a while, these two parties get along pretty well. But everything goes south when Jiang Jieshi, or Chiang Kai-shek, takes over after the death of Sun Yat-sen in 1925. He launches the Northern Expedition to unify China, which he is successful, and then turns against the communists. So, I know, little confused, so if you're maybe it's a little off, but yeah, this is Sun Yat-sen, this is Mao, and this is Chiang Kai-shek. The three most important men in modern Chinese history. Well, at least three of the most important men. The national government faced three key challenges. They only control part of China. The Communist Revolution was still a threat, and they faced increasing Japanese aggression. Chiang decides to focus on the communists. What a brilliant strategy. He managed to nearly crush them, forcing them to flee 6,215 miles to northwest China in 1934 on something known as the Long March. Mao solidifies his role as the leader of the CCP and devises his own style of Marxist-Leninism, known as Maoism, which emphasized the peasants, because Marx said, communism can only happen in an industrial society because peasants already have the land. Well, Mao realized, I can't do that in China where everyone's a peasant, so okay, better develop communism with peasants, and it works sorta if you ignore all the awful economic policies that Mao would later implement. So this is basically China from 1927 to 1936, and as you can see, it is an absolute awful mess. With, this is not even including a messy map of all the warlords that are controlled. I mean, Beijing, would only get retaken by the Guomindang later, and, the Guomindang won't last forever. Japan signs treaties under the League of Nations to limit imperialist activity from 20 to 28. They are one of the big five powers. They pull the former German colony in China, but keep Korea and the rights of Manchuria. They expand franchise to all men, making some progress, and thus establishing fragile democracy, until it was completely obliterated by the Great Depression. Kind of reminds me of what happened to the Weimar Republic. You're noticing a very common theme here. So, this sets off a campaign of political assassinations against liberals, and thus what you get is the rise of reaction of ultranationalist, imperialist, and militarist circles, particularly among the officer corps and the young, who advocate for greater assertion of Japanese power in the region. They decide to look at China because what a lovely target. It's in the middle of a civil war. They can barely survive. So the Japanese troops in Manchuria secretly blow up a small parts of the Japanese-built South Manchuria Railroad as a pretext for war by blaming it on the Chinese. Kind of like Hitler's Reichstag, and as well as the staged attack on the Polish, Hitler's staged attack on a German radio broadcast center and framing the Poles for it. They used this Mukden Incident as an excuse to attack Cherry and gobble up Manchuria. However, this is even more concerning. They didn't even have approval from the civilian government. The army in Manchuria just decided to do it without authorization. They take Manchuria and set up a puppet state. And it's called Manchukuo, led by Puyi, who, if you remember, was the last Chinese emperor. What a tragedy. So sad. So the League of Nations requests the Japanese to withdraw from Manchuria, but Japan says, screw it, we're leaving, and the League of Nations can do absolutely nothing. So, yep, appeasement of expansion nations was born. Hurrah! So, African colonies were forced to participate in the Great War whether or not they wanted to. As requests, volunteers, and conscripts, etc. The Allies invade German-controlled colonies, and this ends up incurred, and as a result, Africans are encouraged to kill previously, sacred white soldiers. Now, due to the messy war, many Europeans are left to be deployed elsewhere. This lack of authority helps encourage local rebellions, especially regarding challenges to European domination, especially regarding conscription. They're all put down by European authorities, but involve the shifting of valuable military resources to put down colonial rebellions. Now, in the post-war, previously somewhat self-sufficient economies were made totally export-dependent. This was basically rapacious capitalism. They also then suffered, to top it all off, and they suffered severe reversals as commodity prices and trade fell more than 50% during the Great Depression. High taxes to pay for infrastructure of exploitation, build the railroad so I can ship off the nice goods instead of helping you guys, forced most Africans to become crop farmers or wage laborers on plantation mines, so the indigenous economy pretty much disappeared. Mining pirates took men from rural labor and paid minimum wages. It was basically just slavery in a new name. As colonial officials resorted to outright forced labor, and abuse began with concessionary companies, or companies authorized by the government to mine crap. For example, you get this with the construction of roads and railroads, resulting in starvation, disease, and maltreatment. Now, unsurprisingly, you get the rise of African nationalism. Africans were given absolutely no self-determination after the war. No surprise. Colonial hold was actually consolidated. Still, incipient nationalism was among the very rarefied new elite. They're often influenced by education and other experiences abroad. For example, Kenyatta of Kenya. They moved to create a modern nation states in Africa. Of course, you also have Pan-African. Of course, you have on the other side of the spectrum Pan-Africanism promoted by Marcus Garvey, which advocate for a "Back to Africa" motto. Some nationalists wanted to go back to deep identities, but most accepted colonial borders. Colonial borders that I need to remind you were not drawn by the locals; they were drawn by Europeans who just wanted to cut up nice colonial possessions based on resource lines. You can imagine how well that will end up with decolonization. Basically, a little summary: rapacious capitalism intensifies. The last shard of self-sufficiency is destroyed. Just disgusting. Alright, so Latin America also began. So now let's focus on Latin America. So you have political independence since the 1820s, but Great War and Great Depression exposed the depth of neo-colonialism. It isn't overt colonialism, but it's economic imperialism nonetheless. For example, the famous banana republics. The Russian and Mexican revolutions radicalized many as Marxism appealed to disgruntled intellectuals and exploited peasants. Now, however, the traditional landed and military classes stayed in power. This explains why this is one of the main reasons why Latin America's economic roadkill, just awful levels of income inequality, which just make with a group of elites who really don't give a crap about the people. That's why Latin America has the highest Gini coefficient even today as poor countries. So increasing U.S. influence is protested by university students. They explore alternate political ideologies, especially Marxism. For example, Fidel Castro. You also have a Socialist Party in Peru by 1928, as well as increasing sympathy for marginalized Native Americans. Example of one of these protesting artists was Diego Rivera. He blended artistic and political vision in vast murals that he intended for viewing and appreciation by the masses. I believe this is from his mural Imperialism, in which he protests how America's economic dominance basically just turned Latin America into its economic dominion and thus crushed it with shocking brutality. There's another work by Diego Rivera. I believe it's work for Frida Kahlo, who also would portray murals of the Mexican of Marxist revolutionaries, of socialist revolutionaries during the Mexican Revolution. The Great War ensured U.S. domination, as huge capital investments were made in Latin America, as well as which encouraged the export of raw materials. Does that remind you of anything right now? Oh yeah, China investing a crap ton in Latin America. Some things never change. So, U.S. economic neocolonialism intensifies under President Taft. He wanted to substitute dollars for bullets to reinforce the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary. This becomes known as dollar diplomacy, aka Yankee imperialism, if you ask any Latin American. Basically, instead of, it's just cheaper just buying them instead of just shooting them. Let's just do that instead. So the Great Depression absolutely crushes cash crop-oriented Latin American economies. Unfortunately, Latin America to this day still remains heavily export commodity dependent. That's why countries like, Argentina, when beef prices collapse, there goes their economy. So as a result, some begin to support domestic manufacturing and practice import substitution, basically economic nationalism. So this is basically a history of U.S. intervention in Latin America from 1895 to 1941. P.S. FYI, spoiler alert, it's going to get a lot worse in the Cold War. So, as we can see, the U.S. intervenes basically everywhere. Nicaragua on multiple occasions, Mexico to chase down Pancho Villa, Venezuela to settle border disputes, Colombia, by basically just by supporting a Panama Revolution, invading, taking control, establishing a protectorate over Cuba, and basically launching troops into Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So now FDR tried to do some good neighbor policy, tried a different approach, the good neighbor policy. It was basically bogus PR spinning at first, as it was cheaper to control Latin American countries by training local National Guards to protect U.S. investments versus U.S. Marines. So an example of this would be Nicaragua. There was a civil war in the 1920s. The U.S. supports the death squad leader Somoza, and this is not even the Cold War, which, that will happen as well. Augusto Cesar Sandinino leads the opposition to the U.S. influence. He is to this day revered as a nationalist hero. He becomes the father of the later Sandinistas movement. Of course, in traditional American fashion, the American-backed death squads end up executing Sandino in 1934 and taking control of the country itself. He remained a loyal friend of the U.S. and built a fortune and establishing a political dynasty. Lovely. Now, FDR eventually renounces intervention as per the Teddy Roosevelt Corollary of the Monroe Doctrine 1933. John Kerry would renounce the Monroe Doctrine itself in 2013, although we're seeing a change in that with the current situation in Venezuela, as Venezuela is, thanks to Hugo Chavez's reckless financial policies, an absolute economic mess. And the President of the United States is considering intervention in order to resolve this situation, which, is reminiscent of the Monroe Doctrine. However, things that's still up for debate because of the unintended consequences. The President of Mexico, Cardenas, anyway, back to this, sorry about that. The President of Mexico, Cardenas, nationalized the Mexican oil industry in 1938. It was previously controlled by U.S. and British interests. Of course, now, unlike other instances, the U.S. decided to back off, as the Roosevelt convinces U.S. and British businesses to accept $24 million in compensation, much less than the $260 million that was sought. The U.S. wants to basically retain support of Mexico with the approaching war. Also, there was also an increasing dependence on Mexican immigrant labor because the 1924 Immigration Act had severely restricted Eastern European immigration, thus causing a labor shortage. Now, Hollywood ends up promoting the good neighbor policy. Example of this would be Carmen Miranda, a Portuguese-born Portuguese-born woman who later lives in Brazil and becomes a star in America. She becomes the lead advertiser of Chiquita Banana of the United Fruit Company, which is the company known for sending all those lovely banana republics. Yay! This is trying to create a much kinder, gentler, image of the imperialists. So this is a picture of Carmen Miranda dressed in that lovely fruit outfit, and that is all.